In my last lecture, I talked about the post-impressionists. In this lecture, I'm going to finish up the 19th century and move into the 20th century with the collection of movements that are sometimes lumped together as fin de siècle, which is just French for end of the century. Symbolism was actually a more important movement in literature and music than in art. Poets such as Baudelaire and composers such as Debussy and Wagner thought that art should spring from the emotions, from the artist's inner spirit, and that the best insight into the inner spirit came from dreams. Not accidentally, this was also the period when Sigmund Freud began to explore the ways that dreams reveal our hidden fears and desires. Here's a non-required symbolist work, just to give you an idea of this ism. The artist was drawn to fantasy and the macabre, again, the unseen world of the psyche. If you notice that sex is a pervasive theme in these paintings, well, welcome to Unit 12 and the modern age. This entire unit should probably get an R rating. Henri Rousseau was a self-taught primitive or naive painter who was much admired by avant-garde, post-impressionist, and expressionist painters. His paintings are very recognizable for their sharp lines, their painstaking detail, their magical subject matter, and finally their frequent focus on dreams. And speaking of dreams, in this case, bad dreams, let's move on to our next required work. Art historians struggle over just where Munch fits in the parade of art history isms. His swirling lines seem reminiscent of Van Gogh, especially Van Gogh's more unbalanced moments. The expressive as opposed to realistic colors also echo post-impressionists such as Gauguin. The dreamscape, for surely this is some kind of a bad dream, or at least as the artist describes it, a vision, points to the influence of symbolism. Munch was a Norwegian painter who won a scholarship to study in Paris, where he encountered both post-impressionist and symbolist works. He was especially taken with Gauguin, who arguably fits into both schools. Munch then moved to Germany as expressionism was beginning to grip avant-garde German artists. Stay tuned for Kirchner. As for what was going on in his head, the quote on the slide recounts how Munch himself describes his vision on the bridge. The painting portrays a real place, by the way, an insane asylum for women, supposedly near enough to hear the inmates scream. It was also apparently a favorite local spot for committing suicide. If you have time, this brief video clip shares some interesting news about this work. The Scream was actually part of a series that Munch called The Frieze of Life, paintings that address the central themes of love, sexual anxiety, and death. And now, drum rolls, we move into the 20th century. You learned about this work over the summer, which seems a long time ago now, doesn't it? So you remember, I hope, Klimt's fascination with patterns and his use of gold to reference Byzantine art and spiritual significance. Klimt was a member of the Austrian secessionist movement, so named because these painters considered themselves to have seceded or left Austria's conservative art establishment. Vienna at the turn of the century was a culture in ferment. It was in Vienna that Sigmund Freud was beginning to publish his extraordinarily influential works, alleging that the subconscious was revealed in dreams and that sexual impulses underlay most human desires, feelings, and indeed actions. Vienna was also a hotbed of anti-Semitism. Little Adolf Hitler was growing up there at this time. One reason the secessionist painters came under attack is that they often worked for and even painted the portraits of Jewish patrons. Again, if you have time, this video clip will talk about sexual imagery in Klimt's work, more R-rated AP art history. It also discusses the secessionist movement. Here again is our bloodthirsty pal Judith, reincarnated as a sexy femme fatale who lures men to their doom. The model was the wife of a wealthy Jewish businessman. This unit contains surprisingly little sculpture, so I'll flash a couple of pieces before we get to our required work. Here's one of Degas' many beautiful sculptures of dancers. And here is a wood sculpture by Gauguin. I think the wooden low-relief panel is a fascinating illustration of the femme fatale we just saw in Symbolist and fin de siècle painting. Gauguin was also, not surprisingly, influenced by Polynesian sculpture. I've included an example from the Marquesa Islands, where Gauguin died in 1903, To the right of that, do you remember, is the Nucorno Micronesian female deity. And this sculpture by the artist of our next required work was the work that featured in the U.S. court case that examined the question of what is art for tax purposes. Did art this abstract count? The judge ruled yes. Brancusi created our required sculpture almost 20 years earlier, before he had moved completely into abstract sculpture. In fact, Brancusi produced several different versions of this sculpture. Our required work on the right is the last. What evolution do you see in this work that will culminate in many ways in Bird in Space? The figures are becoming increasingly stylized and abstract. Let's close with this quote from the Romanian sculptor. Does this remind you of any of our other artists or other works? Actually, Michelangelo said something very similar. So here's a description of the work from the Philadelphia Museum of Art website. That's where the sculpture is housed. And I think it's an especially good example of visual analysis. The embracing figures in the kiss merge into a single form. Two eyes make the oval of a single eye, hairlines sweep into a continuous arch, and arms join to encircle the cubic block. The artist's fourth version of the same theme, it exhibits the greatest formal unity. Brancusi recommended that it be displayed very simply on its own base, in line with his belief that for sculpture, it is the complete thing that counts. Not quite sure what that means, but note that the abstraction does create a greater focus on the material used, in this case limestone rather than the more polished metamorphic form marble. It also reflects the growing influence of African and Pacific sculpture on European artists. Onward and upward in the 20th century. Up next is Expression.